The morning sun cut through the tall glass walls of Monroe Vantage Group, painting long golden streaks across the polished marble floor of the main lobby. Outside, downtown Chicago hummed with the usual rhythm of a Tuesday in late autumn, but inside the building nothing about this day felt usual. A red carpet ran from the revolving entrance all the way to a small raised platform near the central elevator bank. White flowers stood in tall crystal vases along the path. Crews in black shirts adjusted lighting rigs and tested microphones. A large screen above the platform glowed with the company logo and a single phrase, "A new era in healthcare investment." The $420 million merger announcement was scheduled for the early afternoon, and everyone inside Monroe Vantage Group knew today would either lift their chief executive officer to a new level of power or expose her to risks she had spent months pretending did not exist. Adelaide Monroe was 28 years old, and she had not slept more than 4 hours in any of the past 3 nights. She walked through the lobby in a sleek black bodycon dress with a subtle V neckline, her chestnut brown hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her assistants trailed behind her with tablets and folders, but her eyes were locked on the platform ahead. Walking beside her was Dermot Pierce, the company's chief operating officer, a man of 42, who carried himself like someone who had practiced his entrance many times in front of a mirror. He spoke to Adelaide in the low, urgent voice he used whenever he wanted to remind her that he was indispensable. Near the edge of the red carpet, a man in his late 60s moved quietly with a mop and a small wheeled bucket. His name was Otis Bennett, and he had worked in this building for 18 years. His back was slightly stooped, his hair had thinned to a soft cloud of white, and his hands trembled gently from arthritis that had grown worse each winter. Otis knew every corner of the building. He had cleaned this lobby through 3 different chief executives, and he had always tried to finish before the first employees arrived. But this morning he had been delayed by a leaking pipe in the basement, and a thin puddle of water had spread near the edge of the red carpet, and his hands trembled more than usual as he tried to wipe it away in time. He moved faster than his joints wanted him to, and that was his mistake. The bucket caught on the edge of the carpet, tipped sharply, and a long stream of soapy water rushed across the marble. Otis gasped and dropped to one knee, reaching for the bucket with both shaking hands. The mop slid out of his grip and clattered onto the floor with a flat, embarrassing sound that carried through the whole lobby. Adelaide stopped walking. Dermot stopped beside her. Several employees who had been hurrying toward the platform turned and stared. A young assistant in a dark suit pulled out his phone and began filming, pretending to check a message. Someone near the reception desk laughed under her breath. The laugh was short, but in the silence of the lobby, it sounded enormous. Dermot stepped forward first. He looked down at his polished black shoes, then at the tiny droplets of water that had landed on the leather, then at Otis. He spoke loudly, the way men speak when they want every nearby ear to hear them. "Truly impressive," Dermot said. "We are about to greet investors representing hundreds of millions of dollars, and the man we trust with a mop cannot perform the one task he is paid to do." A few people laughed nervously. Otis kept his head down. His lips moved in a quiet apology that no one tried to hear. He reached again for the mop, missed, and watched it slide farther across the wet floor. "Perhaps," Dermot continued, smiling at his own cleverness, "we should rethink the policy of hiring people who turn the lobby into a storage room. Some of us still believe in standards." Adelaide should have stopped him. She had the power to lift one hand, to glance sideways, to murmur a single word, and Dermot would have stepped back. But she felt the cameras turning. She felt the weight of the board members who would arrive in less than 2 hours. She felt the panic she always felt when something out of her control unfolded in front of an audience, and she chose in that moment to perform strength rather than show kindness. She walked over to Otis. She did not bend down to help him. She did not ask if he was hurt. She looked at the puddle, then at the old man on his knees, and she spoke with the calm, surgical voice she had practiced for boardrooms. "Pity is not a substitute for competence," Adelaide said. Anyone who cannot keep up with the standards of this building should learn to remove themselves before they are asked to." The lobby fell silent for a half-second, the kind of silence that comes when people are not sure whether to laugh or look away. Then a few of them laughed anyway, because their chief executive had not stopped them, and because in this building, the rule had always been to follow the loudest voice in the room. Otis lowered his head until his chin almost touched his chest. His hands shook so badly that the wet rag fell out of them and slapped onto the marble. The laughter rose again, softer this time, more like a hiss. In a small alcove near the side corridor, a man in a faded gray work shirt stood very still. His name was Dante Holloway. He was 29 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair and the steady, watchful eyes of someone who had learned long ago that the world told its biggest truths when no one thought it was being studied. He wore plain navy trousers and worn leather shoes, and at his right wrist there was a faint smear of grease from the air handling unit he had checked the night before. Beside him stood his daughter, Matilda. She was 6 years old, with light brown hair pulled into a small ponytail, and she held a worn stuffed rabbit pressed tightly against her chest. The rabbit had belonged to her mother, who had died when Matilda was barely a year old, and the rabbit went with Matilda everywhere, including to her father's job, on the afternoons when there was no other place she could safely wait. Matilda's eyes were wet, but she had not yet started to cry. She watched Otis on the floor and the laughing strangers and her father's still face, and then she tugged gently on Dante's hand. "Daddy," she whispered, "why isn't anybody helping him?" Dante did not answer right away. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Otis. He looked at the chief executive in the black dress, and at the man beside her who was still smiling at his own joke, and he understood with a sudden, quiet clarity that this was not a question he could push aside. He had taught Matilda many things in the years since her mother's death, but the most important lesson, the lesson he repeated almost every night, was that kindness is not weakness. If he stood here and said nothing, he would teach her the opposite. He would teach her that kindness only lasts as long as it is safe. Dante had not always worked with grease on his wrists. His father, Reuben Holloway, had built a small medical software firm in the early 1990s and turned it, over a lifetime, into something his only son still called by its quiet, private name, the Holloway Legacy Fund. Reuben had died of a heart condition 7 years ago, and on the last evening of his life he had taken Dante's hand and asked him to remember 3 things. He said numbers on a report tell you what a company has done, but the way a company treats people without titles tells you what it will do. He said money should be a shovel, not a sword. And he said a man who needs to be feared has already lost the part of himself worth protecting. When Dante had inherited the fund, he had not splashed the family name across magazines. He had hired careful lawyers, kept careful books, and waited for moments when his capital could do real work. 6 months earlier, Monroe Vantage Group had nearly collapsed under a sudden liquidity crisis. A digital hospital project had stalled, several loans had come due, and most institutional investors had begun stepping back. The Holloway Legacy Fund had quietly provided a strategic capital injection that kept the company alive long enough to negotiate the merger that everyone in the lobby was now preparing to celebrate. Dante had asked for one condition. He had asked to remain unnamed in the press, and to be allowed to spend time inside the building as a maintenance contractor. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, how the leadership of Monroe Vantage Group treated the people they believed they did not have to impress. He had told no one his real position. Not the floor manager who handed him work orders. Not the chief executive who passed him in the hallway without seeing him. Certainly not Dermot Pierce, who had once tapped Dante's shoulder and told him to use the service elevator because the main lobby was for guests. Dante had nodded, because that was the kind of person Dermot expected him to be, and that was exactly the kind of person Dermot showed his real character to. His wife, Helen, had died from complications of a heart condition very much like the one that had taken his father. She had asked him, 3 days before she went, to promise her one thing: to make sure Matilda grew up knowing that her father was a man who acted kindly when no one was watching, and bravely when everyone was. He had carried that promise into every room since. So when Matilda asked her a quiet question, Dante did not consider his job. He considered his daughter. He bent down, kissed the top of her head, and stepped forward. Up on the platform side, Adelaide was tightening the corners of her own posture, trying to feel like the woman she presented to the world. She had not slept, and she had not eaten, and beneath the cold, polished surface she showed in meetings, there was a much older fear she did not name out loud. Her mother had spent most of her working life as a housekeeper at a mid-range hotel near the river. Adelaide had grown up watching her mother say, "Thank you," to people who never said it back. She had once watched a guest in a fur coat call her mother slow and stupid because a room had not been cleaned by check-in. She had watched her mother apologize. That memory should have made Adelaide gentle. Instead, it had become the engine of her ambition. She had decided very young that she would never be the woman who apologized to someone in a fur coat. The result was that she had built her career as a kind of armor, and the armor had grown so tight she could no longer feel anything through it. When she saw Otis on the floor, she did not see her mother. She did not let herself see her mother. She saw only an obstacle between her image and her audience, and she reached for the same tools that her mother's old guests had once used on her mother. She did not know yet that this would be the day her armor began to crack. Dante walked across the lobby without hurrying. He was tall enough that the crowd parted around him without thinking. He knelt next to Otis, picked up the mop, and pressed it gently into the older man's hands. He took the rag from the floor, wrung it out, and wiped the small splash of water that had landed near Dermot's polished shoes. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The lobby had been ready to laugh again, but the laughter had no place to land. Dante did not look at Adelaide. He did not look at Dermot. He looked at Otis. "Are your knees okay, sir?" Dante asked quietly. "I am fine," Otis whispered, though his hands still trembled. "Please, son, you do not need to be down here with me. I'm exactly where I need to be," Dante said. Dermot recovered first, because he had learned long ago to fill any silence that did not flatter him. He folded his arms. "How touching," Dermot said. "The contractor and the cleaner. A perfect team. Remember your station, friend. Stand up before someone important sees you." Dante stood. He took his time. When he turned to Dermot and Adelaide, his voice was steady and quiet, and somehow it carried more weight than any of the louder voices that had filled the lobby a minute earlier. "He did not ruin the image of this company," Dante said. "The way you treated him did." A handful of younger employees near the reception desk straightened up. They had been the kind of people who pretended not to hear the way Dermot spoke to maintenance crews. They had told themselves it was not their business. Now they could not look away. Adelaide stepped forward. Her cheeks were warm, though her expression stayed flat. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" she said. Dante nodded slowly. "I do," he said. "You are the chief executive of this company, and Mr. Bennett is a man who has worked in this building for 18 years. Your title does not make him smaller. His uniform does not make you taller. Not where it counts." Adelaide felt the room shift around her. She had been challenged before, in private meetings, intense board sessions, in negotiations with men twice her age. None of those had felt like this. Those had felt like games. This felt like a mirror. She did not look at the mirror. She looked at Dermot instead, and gave the smallest nod. Dermot raised one hand toward the security desk near the elevators. Two uniformed officers crossed the lobby with the practiced calm of men who had performed this small ritual many times. "Mr. Ramshonger, Holloway has caused a disturbance on a day of significant importance," Dermot announced, loud enough for the cameras. "His contract is terminated, effective immediately. Please escort him from the premises." Otis lifted his head sharply. He stared at Dante with eyes that suddenly looked far too young for his lined face. "No," Otis whispered. "Please. I will take responsibility. Do not do this to him." "Mr. Bennett," Adelaide said, in a voice she meant to sound merciful, "return to your work. I am not letting one foolish gesture cost you your wages too." Otis lowered his head again. He understood, the way every person who has ever lived close to the edge understands, that he had just been handed a small piece of bread to keep his mouth full. Matilda had crossed the lobby without anyone noticing. She slipped her small hand into Dante's and looked up at the strangers around her father. "Are you taking my daddy away because I asked him to help?" she said. Adelaide blinked. For a single second the armor slipped, and there was a flash of something almost ashamed in her face. Then she looked away, the way her mother's old guests had once looked away. Dante knelt down in front of his daughter. He put his hands on her small shoulders, and spoke so softly only she could hear him. "You did not cause this, sweetheart," he said. "Some grown-ups punish people for doing the right thing. That does not change what the right thing was. You understand?" Matilda nodded, even though her chin was trembling. "Yes, Daddy." Dante stood up. He looked at Adelaide for the first time as a man, not as a contractor. "You just taught my daughter a lesson about power, ma'am," he said. "In a few hours, this company is going to learn one about responsibility." Adelaide assumed the words were anger. She had heard many fired men say many bitter things, and she had stopped flinching at any of them years ago. She did not realize until much later that he had spoken in the level, calm tone of a man who already knew exactly what was coming. The security officers walked Dante and Matilda toward the revolving doors. Matilda looked back over her shoulder, just once, and saw Otis still standing in the middle of the lobby, alone in his thin gray uniform, the wet rag still in his hand. She lifted the stuffed rabbit and waved it at him, a small private goodbye. Otis raised one shaking hand in return, and that small kindness traveled all the way across the marble. The doors turned. Father and daughter stepped out into the cold morning air. By early afternoon, the auditorium on the third floor was filled. The lights were dimmed at the edges and bright over the stage, and the company logo glowed huge on the screen behind the podium. The front rows held members of the board of directors, the largest shareholders, the chairs of the partner foundations, and a careful arrangement of legal and media representatives. The middle rows held senior staff. The back rows held mid-level employees and journalists invited to observe a moment everyone expected to be a triumph. Adelaide stood backstage in her black dress, took a breath, and stepped into the light. She had decided that the lobby was behind her. The contractor was gone. The janitor was back at work. Her dress fit perfectly. Her voice was clear. She began the speech she had rehearsed for weeks, about vision, about ethics, about the company's belief that people were its greatest asset, about a future in healthcare investment that would set new standards for the industry. In the front row, William Prescott, the chairman of the board, was not listening. He was reading a short, urgent message on his tablet. The legal counsel for the Holloway Legacy Fund had arrived in the building. The fund's executive representative was requesting a change in the program. They wished to address the room before any final signatures were placed on the merger document. William sat very still. He knew, as the senior members of the board knew, that the Holloway Legacy Fund was not an ordinary investor. The fund had been the silent column that had held Monroe Vantage Group upright during the worst months of the previous year. Their 41% voting share in the new capital round gave them the legal authority to freeze the merger if they detected a serious governance risk. William did not know who the executive representative was. He had assumed it would be one of the older men he had met during the rescue discussions, perhaps a financial officer from the family's legal team. Adelaide kept speaking. She did not see William signal to the program director at the side of the stage. She did not see the program director nod, then murmur something to the master of ceremonies. She heard only her own voice describing a company that valued every employee, that recognized the dignity of every contributor, and she allowed herself in that moment to believe what she was saying. The master of ceremonies stepped forward at the next pause. He thanked Adelaide, then turned toward the back of the auditorium. "Before we move to the final signing portion of our program," he said, "we are honored to welcome a representative of one of the most significant strategic investors in our company's recent history. Please join us in welcoming the executive representative of the Holloway Legacy Fund. The back doors opened. Heads turned. There were perhaps 400 people in the room, and most of them had expected to see a sober older man in a tailored suit. What they saw instead was a tall young man in a plain gray work shirt, with worn leather shoes and a smear of grease at one wrist, walking quietly down the center aisle with a small girl beside him. The little girl held a stuffed rabbit. 2 steps behind them walked an older woman in a charcoal blazer, with silver-framed glasses and a leather portfolio under one arm. Her name was Bernice Carter, Senior Legal Counsel for the Holloway Legacy Fund. The auditorium was very quiet. Several employees who had been in the lobby that morning recognized Dante at once. One of them gasped audibly. Adelaide turned slowly on the stage. Her smile froze. Dermot, standing at the edge of the stage with his hands behind his back, went very still. The way men go still when they suddenly understand that a door has closed behind them, and they did not hear it shut. William Prescott rose from his seat in the front row. He walked toward the aisle and offered his hand to Dante. "Mr. Holloway," William said, in the careful formal voice of a man who had just understood a great deal in a very small amount of time. "Welcome. We are grateful that you came." Bernice Carter stepped to the podium beside Adelaide. She did not smile. She opened her portfolio and spoke clearly into the microphone, her voice trained for moments exactly like this one. "My name is Bernice Carter, Senior Counsel for the Holloway Legacy Fund. I am here on behalf of our executive representative, Mr. Dante Holloway. The Holloway Legacy Fund holds a 41% voting position in the current capital structure of Monroe Vantage Group, and was the principal strategic investor in the rescue financing of 6 months ago. Our authority over the present merger requires our affirmative signature for the agreement to take effect. Mr. Rahman. Holloway has asked for the floor, and the chairman of the board has agreed." Adelaide did not move. She was aware, in the smallest, sharpest possible way, of every word she had spoken to Dante in the lobby that morning. She was aware of the laughter she had not stopped, and of the way she had walked past Otis without bending down. She was aware of the way her mother used to look when a guest in a fur coat had finished with her and walked away. For the first time in a long time, Adelaide felt small inside her own dress. Dante walked up the steps to the stage. He did not smile triumphantly. He did not look at Dermot. He glanced once at his daughter, who had taken a seat in the front row beside William, and then turned to face the room. He approached Adelaide. She forced her training to the surface and extended her hand. She tried to speak as though the morning had never happened. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "welcome to Monroe Vantage Group." "We are so glad." Dante took her hand briefly, in a courteous, professional way, then released it. He stepped to the podium. "Before this company asks me to sign anything," Dante said, "I would like to ask the room to see something." The large screen behind him changed. The company logo faded. In its place appeared the live feed from one of the lobby security cameras, played from the recording earlier that morning. There was no music. There was no narration. There was only the footage. The room watched Otis tip the bucket. They watched Dermot lean down and remark loudly on his shoes. They watched several employees turn away to hide their laughter. They watched Adelaide step forward and tell an old man, in front of his coworkers and the cameras, that pity was no substitute for competence. They watched Dante step in. They watched a small girl ask why no one was helping. They watched security walk a man and his daughter out the revolving doors. When the footage ended, the screen went black. No one in the auditorium moved. Dante did not raise his voice. "A company can have a beautiful balance sheet," he said. "A company can have beautiful slides. A company can have a chief executive who can speak about ethics for 30 straight minutes without taking a breath. None of those things tell me what a company is. They tell me what a company wants to look like. I do not judge a company by how it treats its investors. Anyone with money can buy a polite reception. I judge a company by how it treats the people who cannot pay it back." He paused. He looked at Otis, who had been quietly brought into the auditorium and was standing now near the side wall, in his thin gray uniform, with the stunned, half-frightened look of a man who had never expected to be seen by this many people at once. "Mr. Bennett has cleaned this building for 18 years, Dante continued. He has done it in silence. He has done it before any of you arrived in the morning and after most of you went home at night. He made a small mistake today. The kind of mistake a tired man with bad knees might make on any morning. And the answer this company gave him, on its proudest day, was laughter and contempt. Not from one person, from a culture. That is not a small thing. That is the thing." Adelaide opened her mouth. She wanted to explain. She wanted to talk about pressure, about timing, about the importance of the day, about her good intentions. She closed her mouth again. The footage had said everything any sentence of hers might have tried to soften. Dante turned to William Prescott and to the board. "The Holloway Legacy Fund," he said, "will not withdraw its capital today. There are hundreds of employees in this building who did not laugh, and many more across the partner network whose jobs depend on the stability of this merger. I will not punish them for the failures of a small group of leaders. However, the Holloway Legacy Fund will not place its final signature on the merger until certain conditions are accepted publicly by this board." Bernice Carter stepped forward and read the conditions one by one, in the calm, precise tone of a woman who had drafted them earlier that afternoon. The first condition was that Adelaide Monroe would step aside from the role of Chief Executive Officer for a period of structured review. She would not be terminated. She would not be dismissed in disgrace. She would, however, no longer speak from any stage about the people of this company until she had spent meaningful, documented time with each operational department, beginning with maintenance, custodial services, security, reception, and logistics. She would learn their names. She would listen to their concerns. She would not be welcomed back to the chief executive's office until the board's independent ethics committee was satisfied that she had changed her habits, not only her statements. The second condition was that Dermot Pierce would be suspended from his position pending a full investigation into the operational culture of the company. The board would examine not only the events of the morning, but every formal and informal complaint that had ever crossed any desk regarding his treatment of lower-tier staff. There would be no quiet exit and no protective severance. The third condition was that Mr. Otis Bennett would receive a public apology from the company, a substantial good-faith compensation, full medical coverage for the arthritis that had grown worse during his years of service, and an invitation to join the new Employee Welfare Advisory Council. He would not be turned into a symbol. He would simply, finally, be heard. The fourth condition was that every employee in maintenance, custodial services, security, reception, and logistics would receive an immediate base wage increase, expanded health benefits, and access to an independent reporting channel that carried their concerns directly to a committee of outside directors, with legal protection from retaliation by any internal manager. William Prescott listened to every word. When Bernice finished, William stood, faced the room, and said simply that the board would accept the conditions. There was no debate. There were cameras. There were shareholders. There was the footage that had just been shown. There was no path forward that did not begin with yes. Adelaide stepped down from the stage. The stairs felt longer than they had on the way up. She crossed the floor toward Otis. People moved aside to let her pass. She stopped in front of him, and she did something she had not done in front of an audience since she was a child. She looked up at him and her eyes filled. "Mr. Bennett," she said, and her voice broke slightly on his name. "I am sorry. I had no right to make you the example for anything. The only thing this morning lacked was professionalism, and the missing professionalism was mine." She tried to say more. She tried to talk about the pressure of the day, the cameras, the merger, the years she had spent climbing. The words felt hollow before she could finish them. She stopped, and let the apology stand on its own. Otis looked at her for a long moment. His hands were still trembling, but his back was straighter than it had been in the lobby that morning. He was not a man who knew how to deliver speeches. He was a man who knew how to keep a building running. "I do not need your pity, Miss Monroe," he said quietly. "I just need you to remember, the next time you walk through a lobby, that the man who mops the floor has a name. He has a wife who waits for him. He has grandchildren. He has 18 years in this building. You can forget a lot of things in a long career. Please do not forget that again." Adelaide nodded. She did not trust her voice. She nodded again, and that was her answer. 3 months later, the lobby of Monroe Vantage Group looked exactly the same as it always had, and felt entirely different. The marble was still polished. The flowers were still fresh. The receptionists still wore neat, dark blazers. But the way people moved through the space had changed. People said hello to one another by name now. The new Employee Welfare Council met on the first Monday of every month in a real conference room, with real coffee, real minutes, and real consequences. The independent reporting channel had received several complaints within its first weeks, and every one of them had been investigated honestly. Dermot Pierce was gone. The internal investigation had not been brief, but it had been thorough, and the patterns it uncovered had not allowed any other ending. Several lower-tier employees had spoken openly, for the first time, about the way he had threatened them over the years to keep them quiet. The board had thanked them, protected them, and shown them, in small visible ways, that speaking honestly was now safer than silence. Adelaide had not vanished from the company either. She remained on payroll as an operational advisor, and the terms of her review required her to spend meaningful hours every week with each operational department. In the first few weeks, some of the staff had been skeptical. They had seen executives perform humility before. But Adelaide had stopped performing. She had started listening. She learned that the woman who emptied the trash in the executive suite was named Helen and had a daughter in nursing school. She learned that the night shift security officer was named Harold and had served 23 years in the army before this job. She learned, slowly, that her mother had not been weak when she said, "Thank you" to people who did not say it back. Her mother had been the strongest person in those rooms, and Adelaide had spent 15 years misunderstanding her. Dante had not taken the chief executive office. He had no interest in it. He continued to serve as the executive representative of the Holloway Legacy Fund, and his real authority remained where it had always been, in the patient, careful oversight of how the company treated its people. He still arrived at the building most days in plain clothes, still ate lunch from a hand-packed container, and still picked Matilda up after school and brought her with him to the lobby in the late afternoons, when the light was soft and the day's loud work was done. On one of those afternoons, near the end of a clear winter day, Dante came through the revolving doors with Matilda at his side. Across the lobby, Otis was carefully mopping a small spot near the elevator bank. A young employee, no older than 25, was walking ahead of him with a yellow caution sign and setting it down at the edge of the wet floor. Otis nodded his thanks. The young employee smiled and said the older man's first name and then went on her way. Adelaide came down the hall in a simple dark gray sweater and slacks. She did not look like a magazine cover anymore. She looked like a woman who had been working all day. She slowed as she passed Otis, and she stopped. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "how are the knees today?" Otis looked up at her and smiled. "Just a little better, Miss Monroe," he said. "The new chair in the break room helps." "Thank you for asking." Matilda watched all of this from beside her father. She lifted her stuffed rabbit and held it out to Otis for a second, then pulled it back. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "would you hold him? I have to fix my shoe." Otis took the rabbit very carefully, the way a man holds something he understands the value of. Matilda crouched, tied her lace, and rose again. He returned the rabbit. She nodded gravely and tucked it back under her arm. On the way out, Matilda held her father's hand. "Daddy," she said, "why didn't you make her lose everything?" Dante considered the question for a few steps before answering. "Sometimes justice is making people see what they did," he said, "and making sure they cannot pretend they did not see it. People who have to look at their own behavior are usually changed by it." Matilda thought about that. Daddy, she said, is a strong person, the one with the most money? Dante shook his head. He stopped just inside the revolving doors and bent down so that his eyes were level with hers. No, sweetheart, he said. A strong person is someone who can make other people afraid and chooses to do the right thing instead. He took her hand again, and they walked out into the bright winter afternoon. Behind them, Otis lifted the yellow caution sign and carried it gently to its place. Adelaide watched the father and daughter through the glass doors for a long moment, with an expression harder to read than the one she used to wear for cameras. She did not look like a chief executive in that moment. She looked like a daughter who had finally understood her mother. The lobby, once the room where an old man was laughed at, had quietly become the room where a company remembered, every single day, what its people were actually worth.